my book also begins in Los Angeles, where I was born and raised. It was sparked by the story of my grandmother, Ofelia, who I also never got to meet, as she passed away when I was very small. Nevertheless, her stories lived on through my mother. My mother would tell me that Ofelia was born in Chicago and that she was born there because her parents, her father more specifically, had been recruited to work as a railroad worker, a traquero, doing track maintenance. Ofelia's parents were part of a group of thousands of Mexicans who journeyed from states like Michoacan, Guanajuato, Jalisco, and other places to Chicago in the 19 teens and 1920s to work in railroads, steel plants, and slaughterhouses. Ofelia's parents were Purepecha speaking campesinos from Zamora, Michoacan. And by the time Ofelia was born in 1930, her family was living in South Chicago's Mexican Colonia. To my mind, as a young person growing up in LA, this was a strange thing to wrap my head around for a couple of reasons. One, my mom was an undocumented immigrant, and here she was telling me that her mom was a US born citizen. And two, I had no sense of Chicago demographically or spatially. I also couldn't imagine that any Mexicans would move so far away north and to such a cold climate. But the point of my mom's story was that my grandmother was born during the Great Depression, which, along with being the worst economic collapse in the industrialized world, unleashed an intense campaign of state violence upon Mexican people who were rounded up, deported, and repatriated to Mexico as they were blamed by this government for the failures of Wall Street, which had allowed the speculation of profits and value to go unchecked until it finally came crashing down. An estimated 345,000 people of Mexican ancestry were removed from the nation between 1930 and 1935. This included many children born in the United States who, by virtue of birth, were American citizens. This included my grandmother, Ofelia, who was deported with her parents, sent across the border to Michoacan, and never returned to the US again, spending the rest of her life there. My mother told this story with a bit of irony, as she herself was an undocumented immigrant living, working, and raising her own family in Los Angeles, California, fully aware that her mother was a US citizen, but unable to navigate the legal barriers to claim that citizenship as her own. These stories stayed with me, and they shaped me as I thought not only about Chicago as a site of Mexican immigration and a site of city making, but eventually as I thought about the kind of inheritance that was handed to my mother in the form of generational precarity, rooted not only in urban inequality, but in hostile immigration control policies that had real material consequences for Latino communities in the US. The removal of my grandmother from the nation state in the 1930s turned my own mother into an undocumented immigrant a generation later, and it conditioned our lives in particular ways, shaped by immigration status vulnerabilities, poverty, exploitation, and housing insecurity. Like so many scholars, especially first generation scholars, which includes many in this group today, all of these family histories are never fully captured into our history books. And so I turned a personal family history into an intellectual commitment, much like Natalia, whereby I set out to write a history of the city that my grandmother would have inherited had she never been deported. But from the starting point of the precarity caused by a regime of immigration control that was placed upon Mexican people and brown bodies in urban spaces, a kind of racialized alien experience that would come to shape and condition the fight for community permanence for Mexican Chicagoans for most of the 20th century, and arguably one that continues today. My book, Making Mexican Chicago, shows how the Windy City became a major Mexican metropolis during the second half of the 20th century. This demographic growth was fueled by the pool of American cities, propelled by the industrial and post-industrial economies of Chicago that more and more relied on a disempowered, vulnerable foreign workers who were expected to be malleable and expendable to the shifting conditions of American capitalism. Mexican immigrants and Mexican Americans took residence in some of the most disinvested neighborhoods of the city and inside the in-between areas where white Chicagoans kept the color line against Black Chicagoans. Therefore, Mexicans often occupied what I call the unstable vacancies of white flight, the areas that ethnic white families lived in or formerly lived in, or eventually left in the wake of unwanted demographic diversity. In my book, I argue that Mexican community formation and placemaking were constantly shaped by the crucible of demolition and deportation that followed migrant brown bodies, and that these twin projects intersected in ways that contributed to larger systematic forms of spatial containment, the production and placement of inequality, and a politics and struggle for an equitable infrastructure. The book's major intervention lies in showing how a distinct form of Latinx segregation was invented in Chicago, not through law, but as a very localized, malleable social policy practiced by local stakeholders that ranged from city officials, the federal government, political leaders, the real estate industry, all the way down to local business groups, churches, neighborhood groups, and local community leaders. I demonstrate the multiple forms of urban dislocation that were unleashed by the age of gentrification, an era in which land speculators, investment bankers, and municipal officials worked in tandem to replace hard-fought Latinx working class communities with luxury enclaves for wealthier white-collar residents. This was an effort drawn up in market analysis studies, architectural renderings, and policy prescriptions by downtown elites in an attempt to create a new taxable revenue and reverse the trend of white flight that had weakened the city's political and economic order. Therefore, Making Mexican Chicago is at its core about how Latinx communities fought against wealth-driven gentrification and its economic rationale that not only threatened to push out Mexican immigrant families from their buildings, but also stripped them from their communal lives rooted in neighborhoods and proximity to resources. This is a major point in Natalia's book as well. Like Natalia's book, my book demonstrates that community building efforts of immigrants and Mexican Americans that reconfigured Chicago's neighborhoods in ways that would be welcoming and serve as a sanctuary for future immigrants, even under intense economic, political, and social pressures. The forging of a vibrant civic commons by a Mexican diasporic community in the face of anti-immigrant backlash, the privatization of urban space, and mass deportation campaigns. In it, I showed the struggle for migrant city building from the era of urban renewal to the era of neoliberal urban development, with implications for understanding Latinx urban life, immigration enforcement throughout the 20th century, and the infrastructure of cities in the 20th and 21st century.